The number of people in Donald Trump's cabinet who are willing to speak truth to power is rapidly approaching zero. One of the last, Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats, is leaving the White House. He will be replaced by John Ratcliffe, who essentially auditioned for Trump during the Mueller hearings last week.
Respectfully, Director, you didn't follow the special counsel regulations. Respectfully, by doing that, you managed to violate every principle and the most sacred of traditions about prosecutors not offering extra prosecutorial analysis. I agree with the chairman this morning when he said Donald Trump is not above the law. He's not, but he damn sure shouldn't be below the law, which is where volume 2 of this report puts him.
Joining us now, Frankie Figluzzi, former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI, and at this table, NBC News correspondent Carol Lee. Carol, I want to ask you this question. Who is this man, Mr. Ratcliffe, who is now going to be the most powerful person in our intelligence bureaucracy?
Well, as you pointed out, he's a staunch supporter of President Trump. He was elected to the House in 2014. He comes from a very, very Republican district, one of the most Republican in the House. He has served on the Intelligence Committee, but he doesn't have the kind of background that we've typically seen with the previous 5 DNIs. So that's one of the criticisms that he's getting. But he has criticized the FBI for being biased. He's, as we saw from that clip, bought into a lot of the Republican kind of the Republican line that the president is being wrongfully investigated, and he's really kind of curried favor with the president, and obviously that testimony or his questioning is in the light of now what we know, that they had met and discussed his job and he was going to be put forward for it, really kind of casts a different light on it, and you can see it certainly looks like somebody who was auditioning for this job, but those were beliefs that he had long held. Right,
so up until this day, we've had a Trump administration where the people who have had jobs in the national security firmament have all been what we would consider to be people who had a grasp of reality. And we've not had people within the administration in those jobs who've been investigate the investigators types. Now we have someone firmly from that camp, from the Devin Nunes School of Intelligence. And I want to read this New York Times quote and then ask Figs a question here. The New York Times saying something that does not surprise me whatsoever. Some Republicans privately expressed concern, including Senator Richard M. Burr, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, who cautioned the president's advisors that he considered Mr. Ratcliffe too political for the post, according to people familiar with the discussion. So, Frank, I ask you, too political for the post?
I think we've got a combination of too partisan and not qualified. Those two are a dangerous combination. You know, since the beginning of the Trump administration, John, we've been on a slippery slope, not only toward the complete discounting of raw intelligence, but also the weaponization and politicizing of intelligence toward the president's agenda against his enemies, for his personal friends. And so when you appoint someone like Ratcliffe, you run into the true risk of fake news getting to the White House, right? So think about the role of the DNI. It's a post-9/11 position designed to oversee and coordinate the intelligence community, but specifically to make sure everyone's rowing in the same direction. Everyone has got the shopping list every year of what intel to collect, what the priorities are, and then reporting it up to the White House and out to Congress and the public. So if the White House doesn't want to hear unpleasant news in the form of intelligence, like, say, for example, the Saudis are responsible for the murder of Khashoggi, or the North Koreans are continuing their nuclear program, or Putin is poisoning people, if the White House doesn't want to hear it, then it's not going to get collected, and it's never going to get reported, and so we'll live in this fake news, fake intel bubble. That's the danger of somebody like Ratcliffe.
So Frank Figluzzi knows a little bit about national security. Here's another guy who knows something about national security. His name is John Brennan. He used to head the CIA. Let's listen to what he has to say about Ratcliffe here.
I have no sense that Trump is looking for somebody to speak truth to him about all of these challenges around the globe that really threaten our national security. And Mr. Ratcliffe does not give me any confidence at all that he's going to be able to direct the men and women of the intelligence community to do what they need to do at this troubling time.
So, David Jolly, there's two smart guys who know a lot about national security. Sure. Neither of them historically partisan figures, both of whom reading the dangers of this appointment and the motivation for this appointment. Are you as disconcerted by this as they are?
Only by a matter of degrees less so. Look, he could have appointed Jared Kushner to be DNI, and he chose not to. John Ratcliffe, I will say this, I served with him, perfectly capable of running an organization and serving in an executive capacity, be it coordinating intelligence agencies. He is a former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Texas, very capable. What we have seen on display, though, is he is willing to play to the political narrative that enables Donald Trump. I believe Ratcliffe will approach his job with a certain amount of solemn duty. I really do. I think he will present the president with the intelligence the president needs to be presented with. The question is, when the president says, no, we're not going in that direction, or reprioritizes things, or refuses to commit to the fact that Russia and North Korea are adversaries and not friends, does Ratcliffe then fall in line and peddle that narrative public-facing and to the Congress? Based on what we saw in Judiciary, he may certainly be willing to do so. He's a capable person, but is he going to turn this job into a political spot we haven't seen before? I would say the likelihood is probably good.
Yeah, I go back to Frank. Frank, Jolly here tried to put a little bit of a decent face on it. Says this guy's resume, it makes him at least modestly qualified for this job. You know, I've looked over the these last 2.5 years, and you looked around and thought, what are some of the guardrails we have? You know, we've talked about those before. There was Mattis. You know, Coates was one of the last remaining guardrails. The notion that Ratcliffe is going to step in and be the kind of guardrail that Dan Coates was strikes me as implausible, not on the basis of his resume, but on the basis of the kind of performance he's turned in, including last week in front of those two House committees sitting in front of Robert Mueller.
So I'm encouraged by David's personal insights and observations of Ratcliffe, but let's look at the recent record, which is what I have to go on here, and my understanding of the DNI position, having briefed the DNI throughout my career. Look, Ratcliffe's come after the investigators. He wants to investigate the investigators. He harangued Mueller, wrongly so. He's advocated for going after those in the intel community and the FBI and DOJ who the president disagrees with. And so what kind of environment does that create now in the intelligence community if the big boss coming in is someone who says, you do the wrong thing, I don't have your back. You come at this from a true, unvarnished, fact-finding perspective. You send up to me raw intel that's bad news. I may end up advocating going after you. The morale is low enough already in the intelligence community, and I can only imagine that it may well drop even further.
Carol, we go to break right now, but I want to get this quick thing into you. People say it was like he was auditioning last week in those hearings. Do you think he was auditioning in those hearings? Had we heard anything about Ratcliffe being up for this job before last week?
I think, well, there were certainly discussions about that. And, you know, so yes, there was an awareness, absolutely. Whether or not it was a sealed deal, you know, I don't know. Was that part of the audition? But they had already had those discussions. And to the point that you guys are making here, to just underscore, one of the first rifts between President Trump and Dan Coates was when the president asked him to go find evidence that Barack Obama had wiretapped him and to go out publicly and criticize his own intelligence community that he was overseeing. I think those are the questions that people have about, to your point, like whether he is going to, and obviously Dan Coates didn't do that, and, you know, often had conversations with the vice president and said, I don't know what to do here. How do I handle these things? The question is Ratcliffe going to do that same thing? And I think there's a lot of people who think that he won't.
All right.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.